The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, 2020. A quiet street in Mount Morris, Illinois. South Lincoln Street looked the way it always did. Calm, ordinary, the kind of place where nothing much ever happens. One of the homes on that block belonged to a man named Gus Lamesch, a local resident who for the past several weeks had not been living alone. His 27-year-old daughter, Melissa Lamesch, had recently come to live with him. She was 9 months pregnant, counting down the final days before the birth of her first child, a son she had already named Barrett. Melissa's pregnancy had grown complicated, elevated blood pressure, sudden, unpredictable fainting episodes. Her doctors had determined she needed round-the-clock supervision, and her father's home had become the safest place for her to wait out the remaining time. She had a hospital admission scheduled. The birth was imminent. Everything was arranged. Before we begin, like and subscribe for more real-life crime stories that keep the truth alive. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update, and share your country in the comments. It's powerful to see this global community seeking justice. Your support honors the victims. Let's start. At 4:28 that afternoon, the silence of the neighborhood was fractured by a 911 call. A neighbor standing on his own property had looked over at the Lamesch house and noticed something deeply wrong. Dense, dark smoke was pushing out through the window frames and curling beneath the roofline. This was not the thin gray wisp of something forgotten on a burner. This was something far more serious. When fire crews reached the scene, they found the front door locked tight from the inside. Tools were needed to force it open. What waited for them on the other side was devastating. The entire interior of the house had been swallowed by thick black smoke. Visibility was down to approximately 6 inches. Firefighters were reduced to crawling through the rooms on their hands and knees, hands sweeping the floor ahead of them, moving forward 1 blind inch at a time. The fire chief, who had a personal connection to Gus Lamesch, contacted him directly. The moment Gus understood that his daughter was somewhere inside that burning structure, he rushed to the scene. Fire crews now had confirmation of what they feared most. A person was trapped inside, and time was almost certainly already gone. Deep inside the kitchen, they found Melissa. She was face down on the floor. With zero visibility and the heat pressing down on them, rescuers had no choice but to drag her toward the exit, still clinging to the possibility of a miracle. The paramedics waiting outside could only confirm what everyone had already begun to fear. Melissa Lamesch was dead. Her unborn son Barrett had not survived either. Almost immediately, something about the scene felt deeply wrong to the investigators who arrived shortly after. Melissa was not just any victim, she was a trained paramedic. She understood fire behavior. She knew emergency protocols better than most people in that neighborhood ever would. The exits from the house had remained accessible throughout the blaze. The fire had not sealed her in. A person with her knowledge and instincts should have been out of that building within moments of detecting smoke. But she had not moved toward the door, not even a single step. Her car was still sitting in the driveway. The door had been locked from the inside. No one else was found anywhere on the property. Something had gone very wrong before that fire ever started. Fire Inspector Michael and his team couldn't enter the structure until crews had fully saturated the smoldering walls and ceiling. When they finally got inside, the evidence began to tell a story. The most severe heat damage was concentrated in the kitchen. Burn patterns led investigators to a precise point of origin, the upper cabinets directly above the stovetop. The first and most obvious theory was a cooking accident, but a close inspection of the stove quickly dismantled that idea. Every single burner control was turned to the off position. The oven was empty. There was nothing cooking. Melissa had not collapsed over a hot stove. Electrical failure was the next avenue. Specialists went through the breaker panel and examined the wiring for any indication of a short circuit or equipment malfunction. The breakers were functioning exactly as they should. There was no evidence of internal cable damage or component failure anywhere in the system. A technical cause was formally eliminated. In the fire marshal's final report, the conclusion was unambiguous. The fire had been set deliberately. Someone had used an open flame to ignite the furniture. The case had taken a sharp and sinister turn. Lead investigator Brian Kadar was present during the examination of Melissa's body. What he observed stopped him cold. There were injuries on her body that had absolutely nothing to do with heat. Exposure or smoke inhalation. injuries whose origin pointed to something that had happened before the fire. The flames, it became clear, had not been the cause of her death. They had intended to cover it up. To understand what had truly unfolded inside that house, investigators needed to understand the life of the woman found dead on the kitchen floor. Melissa Lamesch was born on May 10, 1993, and grew up in Mount Morris, surrounded by 4 brothers and sisters. Those who knew her described a young woman of fierce determination and an almost unrelenting drive toward excellence. Her brother Carl spoke of how she approached every challenge she undertook. She did not merely try to succeed. She pushed herself until the result was flawless. Her path into medicine began with a personal experience during her college years, when she herself needed emergency assistance and was struck by the professionalism and composure of the paramedics who responded. That encounter redirected her entirely. Before that turning point, Melissa had been organizing trivia nights at a local bar, a place frequented by emergency service workers, and it was in that environment where her admiration for the profession had taken root. In January 2020, after completing her training, Melissa received her paramedic certification and began working for Trace Ambulance in Tinley Park. Her first months on the job coincided with the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Records show she was part of the crew that transported the first confirmed COVID-19 patient in Chicago. The work demanded physical endurance, mental clarity, and absolute mastery of life-saving procedures. Melissa brought all of those things to the job. Around the same time, she discovered she was pregnant. The father of her child reacted not with support, but with pressure, strong, persistent pressure for her to end the pregnancy. Melissa refused. The decision was hers, and she made it without hesitation. By October 2020, her health had become increasingly precarious. Doctors had diagnosed her with high blood pressure, and the fainting spells were growing more frequent and more severe. She was fewer than 48 hours from her scheduled hospital admission. The birth of Barrett was days away. Because of the elevated infection risk in the lead-up to the procedure, her medical team had given her strict instructions. Minimize contact, do not receive visitors, stay isolated as much as possible. Melissa had followed those instructions carefully. She barely left the house. Gus's home already had a nursery assembled and ready. Everything Barrett would need had been purchased and put in place. Everyone in Melissa's life understood that she was spending the remaining time quietly, resting, preparing. But on November 25th, that plan was interrupted. During the afternoon, Melissa had been speaking on the phone with her sister Cassie. Their conversation had stretched across roughly 2.5 hours, an easy, comfortable exchange about daily life and the upcoming hospital visit scheduled for after the holiday. Then, somewhere around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Melissa stopped mid-conversation. She had glanced out the window and seen someone approaching the front door. Her words to Cassie were immediate and unmistakably unsettled. "You've got to be kidding me. Matt is here. I'll just see what he wants and call you right back." Matt was Matthew Plote. His arrival was entirely unannounced. He had given no warning, and for months prior to that afternoon, he had barely been in contact with Melissa at all. Cassie ended the call and waited for her sister to phone back. The call never came. Melissa's phone went dark. She stopped responding to every message and every incoming call. A neighbor confirmed what had happened at the door. He had observed a man wearing a hat walk up to the front porch. He watched Melissa open the door herself and let the visitor inside. That decision, the act of opening the door to someone she had not expected and had not wanted to see, broke the strict isolation she had maintained for weeks. Doctors had been explicit, no contact with anyone outside of her father. She had respected that boundary until that moment. The time that elapsed between Matthew Plote's appearance on the porch and the moment thick black smoke became visible from the street was less than 30 minutes. According to investigators, no one else had been present in that house during that window. Only Melissa and her visitor. Cassie and her husband were at a store when the smoke appeared, entirely unaware that Melissa's intention to quickly find out what he wanted had become the last decision she would ever make. To establish precisely how Melissa Lamesch had died, investigators needed forensic medical data. A standard autopsy typically takes between 10 and 14 business days to complete, but detectives needed answers faster. A blood sample was rushed to a local hospital. laboratory for rapid testing, specifically to detect the presence of combustion byproducts. The result came back within 5 minutes. The carbon monoxide level in Melissa's blood was consistent with a person who had not been exposed to fire smoke at all. The implication was immediate and devastating. Melissa had stopped breathing before the house had filled with smoke. She was already dead when the fire was set. The full autopsy was conducted on December 8th. Pathologists determined that the direct cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation, suffocation caused by external force applied to the airway. Across Melissa's neck and cheeks, specialists identified numerous petechial hemorrhages, tiny burst capillaries that appear when extreme compressive pressure is applied. One of the pathologists who later testified in court stated that the density and severity of those hemorrhages was the worst he had encountered across his entire professional career. The force applied to Melissa's neck had been extraordinary. In addition to the asphyxiation findings, examiners documented injuries consistent with blunt force trauma inflicted in the period immediately before death. There was also evidence of aggressive sexual misconduct. Using a standardized forensic collection kit, specialists gathered biological swabs for DNA analysis. And beneath Melissa's fingernails, examiners found biological material belonging to someone else, a discovery that told its own story. In the final moments of her life, Melissa had fought back. Every sample collected was sealed and transferred to the state crime laboratory. The fire investigation had officially become a murder investigation. Matthew Plote was not a stranger to emergency services. He served as a paramedic for the Carroll Stream Fire District and was a volunteer firefighter. He and Melissa had first crossed paths back in 2013 at one of the trivia nights she used to host. Over the years that followed, they maintained occasional contact, though it never developed into anything defined or committed. When Melissa told him she was expecting his child, the dynamic shifted dramatically. According to case files and statements from Melissa's family, Plote became intensely opposed to the birth. Investigators uncovered communications in which he described the approaching delivery date using a word that struck them as revealing: deadline. Not an occasion. A deadline, a fixed point by which a problem would need to be resolved. After Melissa declined to terminate the pregnancy, Plote effectively vanished from her life. He ignored her health updates. He never accompanied her to a single medical appointment. Melissa continued to send him information about Barrett's development. She believed a father had a right to know, but responses were sparse and eventually non-existent. Melissa's family knew of his existence but had never met him. Her sister Cassie had pieced together his identity from clues on social media, but nothing more. On the morning of November 25, 2020, Matthew Plote had been scheduled to work. He called his captain that morning and reported that he would not be coming in, citing a leg injury. Investigators later looked into that claim and found it to be entirely fabricated. Plote had sought no medical attention. There was no injury. He had cleared his schedule deliberately. With the day now free, he drove to Mount Morris. By 4 p.m., he was standing at the threshold of the house where Melissa was staying. In the hours following the fire, Matthew Plote was brought to the police station for an initial interview. Detectives informed him that Melissa had died. They told him that their son had not survived either. Plote's response was a few seconds of silence, followed by a single word: "Okay." Over the course of a multi-hour conversation, he never asked a single question about what had happened. He never asked how the fire had started. He never asked where Melissa had been found. He expressed no. Shock asked for no time to process the information and displayed no visible distress of any kind. Investigators noted in their reports that his manner throughout remained casual and entirely composed. When Plote offered his version of events, he described arriving at the house around 4 o'clock to discuss finances and his planned involvement in raising Barrett. He claimed they had spoken calmly in the kitchen for approximately an hour, and that before he left, the two had engaged in a consensual sexual encounter. This claim raised immediate red flags. Melissa had been in the final week of a medically complicated pregnancy. Due to her dangerously elevated blood pressure and the severity of her fainting episodes, she had barely been eating and spent the majority of her days sleeping. Her family and medical records painted a picture of someone in a deeply fragile physical state. The prospect of a consensual, intimate encounter under those conditions was, according to everyone who knew her, situation essentially impossible. Despite these glaring inconsistencies, investigators did not yet have the forensic evidence needed to formally charge him. The autopsy and DNA results were still pending. Plaut answered the questions put to him and was allowed to leave the station that night. As investigators waited for the laboratory data, they began constructing a more complete picture of Matthew Plaut's life. What emerged was deeply troubling. Despite the close-knit nature of fire station culture, where crew members typically share news of major life events, none of Plaut's colleagues had any awareness that Melissa existed. Captain Robert Schultz later confirmed that Plaut had never once mentioned her name or her pregnancy. At a workplace where the arrival of a child was typically celebrated openly, Plaut had maintained complete silence. A deeper look into his personal relationships revealed that he had been maintaining simultaneous relationships with multiple women. At the time of Melissa's death, he was living with a long-term girlfriend who had no knowledge of Melissa or Barrett. No one in Plaut's personal circle had been told that in 2 days he was scheduled to become a father. And in the days following the fire, Plaut told no one about what had happened. He withheld from everyone, colleagues, acquaintances, his girlfriend, the fact that the mother of his child had died in a house fire. Even as a firefighter himself, he said nothing. Prosecutors would later argue that this carefully maintained anonymity was not accidental. It was a calculated strategy. Melissa's existence threatened everything Plaut had built: his relationships, his reputation, his lifestyle, child support obligations, active fatherhood, the inevitable exposure of his secret. All of it would have followed from Barrett's birth. The prosecution's position was clear. Plaut had decided to eliminate the problem before it could become permanent. The fire marshal and forensic specialists examined the blaze itself with painstaking care. The location of the fire's origin, the upper cabinets above the stovetop, suggested a deliberate attempt to make an intentional act look like a domestic accident. It was not a random choice. Matthew Plaut, drawing on his professional training as a firefighter, understood how fires behave, how they spread, and what they destroy. Investigators concluded that the fire had been positioned specifically to consume the biological evidence in the area where Melissa's body lay. The flames were a tool designed to erase what had happened in that kitchen. By the summer of 2021, while DNA results were still being processed, investigators decided to try a different approach. Detective Kadar believed there was a chance Plaut might open up to someone from his own professional world. In early September, police approached Captain Robert Schultz with a proposal. Would he be willing to wear a concealed recording device during a private conversation with Plaut? Schultz had reservations, but ultimately, he agreed. On September 9, 2021, Schultz called Plaut into the station for a meeting. A recording device had been placed on a desk inside the office. Investigators monitored the conversation from an adjacent room. The captain raised the subject of Melissa and Barrett repeatedly, pressing his colleague to be honest about what had occurred that day. Matthew Plaut sat across from him, head lowered. He gave almost no response to the questions. The audio recording captured long, heavy silences. The attempt to obtain a confession through a trusted colleague had produced nothing. The only path forward was through science. In March 2022, the State Crime Laboratory completed its analysis of the biological samples collected from the scene. The findings were definitive. The male DNA recovered from beneath Melissa's fingernails matched Matthew Plaut. In the final moments of her life, Melissa had clawed at her attacker hard enough to collect his skin cells beneath her nails. Furthermore, Plaut's DNA profile matched the material recovered during the sexual assault examination, providing scientific grounds to formally reject his claim that their encounter had been consensual. When investigators cross-referenced the DNA findings with the physical trauma already documented by the medical examiner, the severe petechial hemorrhaging, the blunt force injuries, the signs of a desperate physical struggle, every element pointed in one direction. An arrest warrant was issued on March 8, 2022. On March 9th, which was Gus Lamesch's birthday, authorities took Matthew Plaut into custody. He was formally charged with a total of 10 counts. including 4 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of intentional homicide of an unborn child relating to Barrett, and additional charges of aggravated criminal sexual assault, residential arson, and concealment of a homicidal death. His bond was set at $10 million. The defense attempted in April to have that figure reduced, pointing to Plout's lack of any prior criminal record. The judge rejected the motion, ruling that Plout represented a significant danger to the community. He was held at Ogle County Jail as the case moved toward trial. To reconstruct what had happened inside Gus Lamesch's home on November 25, 2020, investigators worked backward from the forensic evidence. The burn patterns, the biological material, the injuries cataloged by the medical examiner, and assembled a sequence of events. Matthew Plout arrived at the house at approximately 4 p.m. Melissa opened the door and let him in. Whatever conversation occurred between them ended in violence. Plout engaged her physically. Melissa fought back with everything she had. The DNA beneath her nails was the proof. He struck her multiple times with a blunt object and committed an act of aggravated sexual assault. Then he applied a chokehold, pressing with such sustained and extreme force that capillaries ruptured across her face and mucous membranes. When Melissa stopped breathing, he moved to the next phase of his plan. Drawing on his knowledge of fire dynamics, Plout selected the upper cabinets above the stove as his ignition point, calculating that the fire would spread quickly toward the kitchen floor where Melissa lay, destroying biological evidence and masking the trauma to her neck. He set the fire and left the house before the smoke became visible from the street. One significant error: every burner on the stove had been left in the off position, a detail that fire investigators flagged immediately since it demolished the accidental cooking fire narrative he had tried to create. At 4:28 p.m., a neighbor noticed the smoke and called 911. By the time emergency personnel arrived, Melissa was already gone. Barrett had no chance of survival after the loss of blood flow from his mother. The trial of Matthew Plout began in March 2024. The defense built their case around his professional record, emphasizing his years of service as a paramedic and volunteer firefighter. Their central argument was pointed: if Plout had truly intended to commit a crime and use fire to conceal it, why hadn't he set a fire capable of destroying the entire structure and eliminating all physical evidence? They also accused investigators of tunnel vision, alleging that other possible suspects had never been seriously considered. Prosecutors responded by dismantling the premise entirely. There was no other suspect with any reason to want Melissa dead. There was no one else whose life would have been simplified by her absence. The state laid out methodically how Plout had concealed his relationship with Melissa from every corner of his life, his girlfriend, his colleagues, his family, and argued that this concealment was itself evidence of intent. He had kept Melissa invisible so that her death would raise no questions. The hearings continued for 5 days. Jury deliberations took 2 hours. Matthew Plout was found guilty on every count, including first-degree murder and intentional homicide of his unborn son. As the verdict was read aloud, Plout showed no reaction. He stood exactly as he had sat through the interviews years before, composed, still, giving nothing away. On June 27, 2024, at his sentencing hearing, Plout was given life in prison plus an additional 75 years. Before he was taken from the courtroom, he made a statement claiming that he felt the same grief over the loss of Melissa and Barrett as their own family did. His attorneys subsequently filed an appeal, which has yet to produce any result. Melissa's family chose to honor her memory in a way that reflected who she was. A magnolia tree was planted at the Morton Arboretum, a place she had loved. A memorial plaque was placed beside it. Donations were made in her name and Barrett's to organizations supporting animals and those in need, ensuring that both names continue to be associated not with what was taken from them, but with what they gave. I truly appreciate you staying with me until the end of this video. Your continued support is the reason this channel keeps growing and improving. If you haven't already, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you're always updated. And don't forget to leave a comment. Your feedback, ideas, and conversations help build a strong and aware community here. Before you go, remember that awareness is your strongest protection. Always pay attention to your surroundings, listen to your instincts, and take your safety seriously. Even small steps can prevent bigger problems in the future. Look out for yourself and the people around you. Thank you once again for your support. Stay prepared, stay cautious, and I'll see you in the next video.